each breath. Cut through my skin.
He could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved.
And blow wind to wind.
He was enormously popular with the people. He was somebody who was seen as a completely different kind of king to every other.
You won't find me.
He was definitely a dandy, Edward. It was extraordinary given who his parents were.
You won't find me.
He was less dutiful.
Free.
Nobody wanted him to become king.
I think he was a selfish, stupid man.
I hope that he would fall off his horse while racing and break his neck.
They went to meet Hitler.
Is that somebody who claimed not to be a Nazi, he spent an awful, awful lot of time in the company of people who were.
He saw Hitler as a dynamic, charismatic leader, much like himself.
When the Germans said, "Will you come on a tour?" and Edward said, "Will you treat this like a royal tour?" and they said yes.
There was definitely a plan to reinstate Edward as king. If George VI and his family could be either assassinated or done away with or just moved, a puppet ruler installed on the British throne who was sympathetic to the Nazis and to Hitler.
Edward would, in fact, like Germany to defeat Britain and then put him back in charge of the British monarchy then.
And finally, for Edward, can you summarise the kind of person he was and his legacy?
I think everyday life in 20th century Britain was completely different from life we experience today. I think there was a much stronger moral code, a far greater respect and reverence for the monarchy, and a sense that people led a much more ordinary, disciplined life in a way. There was greater sense of poverty, a greater sense of reverence for authority, and a greater respect for the church.
So at the start of the 20th century, it remains a largely industrial society. Most people work in towns and cities. There's a large working class. They increasingly frustrated because they want greater political power. They haven't achieved that until 1918. It's also the case that Britain falls into a depression as a result of the Wall Street crash, which emanates from New York.
There was a general feeling of depression, both in terms of economic depression, but also social depression, because lots of young men had died, the country was impoverished. But there was a general sense also that Britain was no longer great. There was a sense of the days of empire, the days that people could be certain of Britain's place in the world had rather elapsed. And so when George V became king, there was a real sense that rebirth was needed and that there was a new kind of monarchy that people were looking for.
George V was a king who had to deal with a series of crises that coloured his reign, ranging from the First World War to the rise of communism and fascism, the Great Depression, and latterly the fragmentation of the empire. He was a king who had to move with the times. He did so by presenting himself as a figure of duty, who took his responsibilities as king very seriously, who put the nation ahead of his own desires. King George V had quite a strained relationship, certainly with his sons. He was quite an old-fashioned figure. He was very much a Victorian. He was quite backward-looking and at first quite resistant to the change brought about by things like new technologies and developments in the mass media. His children, and particularly his sons, they were more forward-looking. They enjoyed exciting social lives. They were very active on London society scene. They parted with the great and the good.
So of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife Mary was cold as well. And there's very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what he was expected to do as a royal prince was something that he laboured home intensively. And if we look at it now, we almost regard it as abusive because we look at the idea that these children were being treated in ways that were not humane and were not kind.
While we can say that George V was definitely a good king, we cannot say that he was a good father. It was Edward VII's former mistress, Freda Dudley Ward, said that you could never blame Edward for his problems because he had had such a terrible time at the hands of his parents. And George and Mary were incredibly old-fashioned Edwardian parents, believing that children should be seen, even rarely, and not heard. Apparently, Freda Dudley Ward said of Edward that he had always said that he hated his father and his father was horrible to him. And while he loved his mother wouldn't let him love her, and that she always sided with the king. So it was an incredibly authoritarian, disciplined, cold, emotionally unrewarding childhood. It's really interesting that Edward said of his childhood that Christmas was Dickens in a Cartier setting. And I think that really sums it up, that while they had the trappings of wealth and incredible luxury, there was tremendous neglect. And even when the family had no visitors, in the evening they would dress for dinner in full regalia, in tiaras, in diamonds, but there was no emotional warmth. The children were educated by pretty mediocre governesses and tutors. Edward later said that he had a curious type of loneliness, that even though he had all these siblings, and even though they were brought up in royal palaces in Sandringham, in Windsor and Balmoral, all these places that we see as looking so splendid, there was actually tremendous emotional neglect. Edward VIII is quite a difficult man to really pin down. At the end of writing my book about the Windsors, I was still conflicted about him because in many ways he was very spoilt, he was very indulged, he was the opposite of his father who had duty inbred in every pore, whereas with Edward, duty was drilled into him, which he really resented. So he wanted to be more spontaneous, he definitely was more modern, he went against the grain of his upbringing, the establishment, his background. He was a product of his upbringing. He was both spoilt and neglected. He was both, in a way, modern, but also he still used his rank when he could. Ultimately, I think he was a selfish, stupid man.
Prince Edward, who later became Edward VIII, was quite possibly the most unsuitable man who ever became king. Everything about his character was entirely unsuited to the role of a monarchy. But this could be seen even as a young man, because from his university days at Magdalen College, Oxford onwards, he was somebody who escaped from this rather chafing boundary that he found himself under, because his parents had essentially told him all of his young life, you are going to be this dutiful prince, you are going to be king, you are going to do this, you're going to do that. By the time that Edward was of age, he had a simple answer to this: no, I'm not. And I suppose it was this tension between his upbringing and the values that had been instilled in him by governesses, by his parents, by courtiers, by all those around him, and his own inclinations that later spelt disaster both for him and nearly for the country. But in terms of what he was like, he was quite amicable as a young man because he was somebody who he enjoyed going to nightclubs, he enjoyed jazz, he enjoyed drinking, and he was certainly the first member of the royal family, apart from Edward VII, in a different sort of way.
There was one time when he came to breakfast with George V and he was wearing the new style of trousers with turn-ups, and his father bellowed, "Is it raining in here?" You know, absolutely disgusted by this more modern style of dress. So he definitely was a rule breaker. He wanted to push against the boundaries of convention. He followed his heart over his head. He was the antithesis of the emotionally contained, royal, dutiful king or heir apparent.
Members of the royal family had not traditionally been interested in clothes and fashion before Prince Edward. It had been seen as something that essentially you were taken to a rather dry or stuffy tailor or a rather dry and stuffy dressmaker and attired in the most formal and unflattering of garments. But Prince Edward was cut from a rather different kind of cloth. He was somebody who saw himself as a trendsetter, and he wanted to go to the very finest tailors, the very finest couturiers, and he would go off to Paris and he'd choose fabric and things like that. And he was genuinely interested, not just in how he looked and how he dressed, but in how he's presenting himself. And I mean, if you look at photographs of him as a young man, he knows what to do with a camera. I mean, he's got this star quality, which you simply cannot fake. And that, I think, is why he was somebody who was so beloved by so many people, because he was good looking and he was glamorous.
He was definitely a dandy, Edward. I mean, it was extraordinary given who his parents were and their rigidly conformist, rather dull style of dress, that suddenly here was this character who championed the Prince of Wales check, who wore knickerbockers, who wore flamboyant clothes, and also he wore his signet ring the European way, the continental way, which the British gentlemen always wear their signet ring with the crest facing in because it's to use on seals. But Edward insisted on wearing his signet ring the continental way with the crest facing outwards, and that was considered very arriviste of an English gentleman of that time.
He was excited by change and innovation. As a man, he engaged in lots of outdoor pursuits, things like flying, golf, skiing, swimming. He was a real sort of showman in that respect. Edward was the soldier prince. He was expected, given his age, to set an example to other young men of his generation by going to the Western Front as a symbol of British manhood, of what other young men should be doing. Unfortunately, when he got there, he wasn't actually allowed to fight, and he found this very frustrating. He was kept away from the front line. He wanted to be on the front line. He wanted an opportunity to test his manhood, to test his masculinity, like other people of his class.
And it was completely devastating for him when they said that because of who he was, he couldn't risk going to the front. And when he was later awarded the Military Cross, he said that he felt a complete fraud. He didn't deserve it. He had a feeling of self-loathing that he had these positions, but he didn't feel worthy of them when he saw the courage of his fellow soldiers risking their lives and losing their lives. I think that period actually is one of the most admirable in his life and shows his better qualities.
Like a lot of young privileged men, he saw the First World War, or the Great War as it was called, as a simple battle of good against evil, and of course he saw himself as being very much on the side of good. But what it did do, and this I think became crucial in his later life, was it also gave him a great respect for the Germans, because his family had German heritage, and he was, like a lot of his men, fighting against people who he didn't think were actually bad. He didn't think the Kaiser was bad. He just thought it was something that it was an unfortunate territorial war.
Edward's sort of main romance, he had lots of relationships and they all tended to be with married women, which of course drove his family mad and raised concerned eyebrows at court. His main relationship before Wallis Simpson was with a woman called Frida Dudley Ward, who was half American, half British, married with 2 teenage daughters. There was one period where he wrote her over 2,000 letters. And he had this obsessional need in relationships for the woman to be a sort of mother figure to him.
You enjoy your dancing with the prince? Of course, I think anybody would enjoy it. It was awfully lucky. Well, I think you were so lovely that night that I couldn't think of any better partner for the prince. That's awfully sweet of you to say so. It was just awfully nice. And before I met him, of course, I was scared to death. I didn't know what I was going to say to him.
Really, Mrs. Dudley Ward was a very good influence on him, and because she was a sort of establishment figure, that relationship, although frowned upon, was kind of accepted, and she withstood his other affairs. And it wasn't until Wallis Simpson came along there was a serious contender to Mrs. Dudley Ward's position as the Prince of Wales's mistress.
You could debate this one because Edward and Wallis first met. There's several different accounts of how they first met. Some people say they first met at a meeting at Bryanston Court. Some people say that they first met at another social occasion altogether. What is quite clear is that their first encounter, which would have been in either the late 20s or the early 1930s, was not wildly auspicious. It wasn't as if the two of them met across a crowded room and immediately fell in love.
I think the sense that you get is that Edward is sort of in awe of a woman who refuses to placate him and kowtow to him in the way, the sort of rather nauseatingly, sucking up way that the rest of the British society would have done, that Wallis was very much her own woman. And of course she was intrigued by the Prince of Wales and incredibly flattered as she became involved in his milieu. But in her mind, this was just a sort of frisson, a flirtation, a bit of fun, and she was firmly married to her second husband. And we know this because she wrote a letter to her Aunt Bessie saying, "What a bump I'll get when the prince settles down and finds a suitable, royal bride." Well, the problem for her was that didn't happen. Events absolutely spiraled out of her control due to his inability to let her go or give her up.
Edward really liked the fact that Wallis was sharp-tongued, quick-witted, she had a great sense of humour, and she didn't suffer fools. Always spoke to him as an equal. She didn't treat him as a kind of superior, and I think he liked the fact she would hold him to account in terms of his behaviour, something that he didn't get from the other women that he'd spent time with.
Wallis Simpson came from a very well-bred American family. I quite loved it that later in life Diana Mosley said, she was so much better bred than Grace Kelly, another famous American export. She was very well educated. She went to a very good all-girls school, Oldfields in Baltimore. And she was very well read. She's very, very bright, Wallis. Her father died when she was a baby and her mother was a single mother, and her childhood was difficult. She absolutely adored her mother, but they were very much at the mercy of her mother's brother, Uncle Sol, who was a very dictatorial, difficult, demanding man. And the reason I think that Wallis married incredibly young was because she felt that she would have a form of financial security, and that would be a relief for her mother. I came to love Wallis Simpson. I honestly feel that I wish she had been my best friend. She was incredibly loyal. I have read her letters to her girlfriends. Premier thing that shines through is her loyalty. She's written off as this adventurous, a man's woman. She wasn't at all. She was a woman's woman. She adored her girlfriends and they adored her. At the most extreme moments in her life, she writes letters to her girlfriend saying, "I wish we could just sit together, I miss you, I send you love." They supported her in the most incredible way.
I think Wallis, to some extent, found a soulmate. He was a bon vivant. He lived well, he lived fast, he enjoyed the high life. He loved new technologies, he travelled widely, he partied hard. These are things that appealed to Wallis. It was also the case that he could offer her a kind of lifestyle that she wasn't necessarily getting from her husband at the time. So in that respect, he represented a kind of security as well. It was also the case that Edward had a great sense of humour. He was well known for being able to tell good jokes around the dinner table, and I think she admired that in him as well. Perhaps also there was something of a lost soul. Edward has been widely portrayed by biographers and historians as someone lacking a sense of direction, and I think to some extent she felt that she could offer him that sense of direction. It was well known in high society that this affair between Wallis and Edward had been going on. Over the course of 1936, the British government also increasingly came to learn about the relationship. However, it was hidden from the British public, and this is because the great press barons, Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, had conspired together to basically say to other Fleet Street editors of newspapers that they mustn't publish the story about Wallis and Edward, that this must be kept a closely guarded secret. This was because there was real concern about what the public response would be. And ultimately, they were very successful, Beaverbrook and Rothermere, in keeping this a closely guarded secret right through until the end of 1936.
What surprised people was, first of all, that she was American, which was seen as vulgar. Secondly, that she didn't come from a grand family, but was the daughter of a Baltimore boarding house proprietor. And thirdly, the fact that he seemed to be completely and utterly besotted by her, because Edward was very unusual in that he wasn't a married man. I mean, usually kings were married and it was just a given that you would have a wife who would become queen and children. But Edward had none of this, which of course led to rumours about sexual dysfunction. And Wallis, for whatever reason, was this figure who she'd ingratiated herself in higher society. She'd hosted many dinner parties and lunch parties. One guest said Wallis's parties have so much pep you never want to leave. And I think what's interesting is that the wider public knew nothing about this, even though Edward was quite happy to flaunt her in public and was always seen around with her very much as his official companion.
One of the cruelest aspects of history in this respect is that everybody in the Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson's circle who met Mrs. Simpson really liked her and really admired her and could see what a good influence she was on the king. However, it was the unholy trinity, as I call them, of palace, parliament and church who did not want Edward on the throne, and in my opinion, Mrs. Simpson became the suitable scapegoat for that. So within their society circle, there was a sense of acceptance that this was the woman that the Prince of Wales had chosen, and they could see a beneficial influence. The public were kept out of the picture. They knew nothing because there was a press moratorium, press blackout on it, and there was this absolute rage and sense of revolt in the palace and partly in Parliament and certainly within the church.
Well, when his father died, he greeted his father's death with absolute hysteria, and he was throwing things around and shouting and unable to respond to it. And I think a lot of people thought this was a very bad omen of what was to come, and they were proved right. Because Edward VIII is, in my opinion, the worst king who ever sat on the throne. He was somebody of quite a staggering self-absorption, mixed with a little light treachery. And I think that what he tried to do to the monarchy, if he had stayed on the throne any longer, would have systematically ruined it as an institution.
As a king, Edward took his role quite seriously, certainly when it came to being out and about in amongst his subjects. When he'd been Prince of Wales, Edward was very active, going out into villages, towns, cities, meeting, greeting ordinary working class people. There was a great deal of affection for him among the British public because he had this special intimate relationship with them. This continued when he was king. However, in terms of the business of government, he was less dutiful. He wasn't as exacting as his father. He wasn't as committed to going through government papers, to signing those off. Often courtiers would come home and find government documents covered in sort of stains from wine glasses and that sort of thing. He didn't take that work as seriously as he should have done.
Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, was standing at a point-to-point with the courtier Tommy Lascelles, and Edward was doing one of his point-to-point rides. And Tommy Lascelles turned to Stanley Baldwin and said, "You know, sir, I often think that when we're waiting for the result of the point-to-point to come in, the best thing that could happen would be to hear that the Prince of Wales had fallen and broken his neck, and Baldwin replied, "God forgive me, so do I."
Even before Edward became king, there was a general sense that he was a security risk, and the main reason why he was seen as a security risk were that his links with the Nazi Party and his friendship with von Ribbentrop, who would later become British ambassador, were seen as enormous potential threats to national security. At a time of great international unrest, the last thing that Britain needed was a king whose personal and indeed political motives were seen as suspect. And so Edward was being watched even before he became king. When he did become king, at the beginning of 1936, this intensified quite significantly. Unfortunately, MI5 had some involvement, and we don't know to this day precisely how much, in a botched attempt to assassinate him in the middle of the year, which I think was something that rather put the cat among the pigeons in terms of how MI5 were actually regarding what Edward was trying to do. But the story is a fascinating one. It's about this man called George McMahon, who was an MI5 informant, who essentially conducted a botched assassination attempt on Edward in Hyde Park in July 1936. It was covered up for years. I mean, all the information about it just sat in a vault somewhere. And then when I actually discovered what had gone on, it's an astonishing story, because you see the level to which Edward was loathed and mistrusted by the security services and by those who were in the higher echelons of government. When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman, indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne.
Edward made a speech immediately after he abdicated to the British people via the BBC radio airwaves.
Has ceased to reign over Great Britain and the British Empire. He announced his decision to abdicate in a farewell broadcast heard by 150 million people around the world. The radio message put an end to the crisis in England that began when the king announced his marriage to an American divorcee, Mrs. Wallis Simpson. Parliament passed a special bill legalizing the abdication.
This is Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
Edward always knew that abdication was a possibility. If we go and look at the diaries of his friends and associates earlier on in 1936, when they're talking about the affair before it's become public news, we know that Edward was already considering this idea that he might have to abdicate in order to marry the woman he loved. However, this was not plan A. He would have preferred to stay as king. This was a role he cared about deeply, that he wanted to play, and he wanted to marry the woman he loved. Ultimately, he was pushed towards option B, which was ultimately giving up the throne in order to marry Wallis.
In one sense, it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved, and that this relationship meant more to him than anything. However, for a man like that who'd been brought up in that household, obviously to abdicate was the most seismic, devastating event. And I think he genuinely felt terrible at letting the people who loved him down. I don't think it was a question of he felt guilt at betraying the palace or Parliament, because I think he felt they had betrayed him, actually.
Wallis did not want Edward to abdicate for the very simple reason that Wallis was terrified of what was going to happen to her. She enjoyed being the mistress of the Prince of Wales. She enjoyed the financial advantages it gave her, the social advantages it gave her, the gifts that were lavished upon her, the fact that she could live in the life and the style that she'd always been accustomed to. But as Edward's reign went on, she began to get more and more frightened, because she was the subject of personal abuse. The house she was living in Regent's Park had its windows smashed. There was the constant worry that she was going to be attacked, or worse. And she began to feel, by the time of the abdication crisis, that she did not want to be embroiled in this. So she actually fled to France when it was at its peak, and she tried very, very hard to give Edward up. But Edward would not give her up, and in fact, we've seen some of the letters and the telegrams they exchanged, and it's utterly terrifying, because he was so obsessed by her that at one point he said, "Of course you can go anywhere you want. You can go to China, you can go to Newfoundland, but wherever you will go, I will follow you."
The greatest myth about Wallis Simpson is that it's been convenient for history to paint her as the wicked witch in this and the woman that pushed for abdication. That is the biggest lie. There is absolute concrete evidence from her friends, from her letters, from her own memoir, that she absolutely did not want the king to abdicate, that she begged him not to abdicate, that she was desperate to, as she said, slip away and fold my tent. When she tried to escape him prior to the abdication and say, "Look, please don't do this. I shall watch you from afar. You can be an effective king." And just prior to the abdication, one of his courtiers said he was exalté to the point of madness, and at this point was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he literally emotionally blackmailed Wallis and said, "If you leave me, I shall kill myself." And there was a really real possibility of that. He was so unhinged at this stage, and she just couldn't risk that.
We know that Bertie, as Edward's younger brother, was very anxious about becoming king. He wasn't a public figure on the same level as his brother had been. He wasn't very good in front of the cameras. He struggled to make speeches. He was a reluctant monarch in that respect, and he knew that becoming king would mean that he had to put his home life, his family, on the back burner, that he had to embrace duty, responsibility now first and foremost.
In the one sense, because he was so heart-led, it wasn't a difficult decision because his heart led the way. But I think in his head, obviously, there must have been conflict. And he loved his brother, and he knew the strain he was then going to be putting onto his brother. But as he said, Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. In fact, Edward didn't cause collapse in the country. It was better for the country that he wasn't king. What I think is admirable is that in the run-up to the abdication, all the politicians said to him, "Look, for goodness sake, be crowned king, have a period when you're king, have Mrs. Simpson as your mistress on the side," effectively as we've all done and everyone in the establishment does. And then in a year you can announce that really you can't live without, and she can sort of, very much like Charles and Camilla, she will be phased back into public life. Well, he was completely honourable because he said, "I cannot go through the coronation. I cannot drink the holy waters of Jordan with a lie on my lips." And he also said, "I'm not going to do what they want me to do, which is to have Mrs. Simpson, in a little house with a garden gate, and I have the key and I creep in there, because she's worthy of more than that. She's worthy of being my wife."
It was decided that Edward could not remain in Britain any longer. because it was felt that having an ex-king in his own country created a situation that was both rife with constitutional issues, but it was also difficult from a perspective of how he would be regarded, because there was always a fear of Edward having a kind of rival court, because there was such public sympathy towards him.
After the abdication, Edward left Britain for Europe. He travelled to Austria. He had to wait 6 months to be reunited with Wallis, and that was because Wallis's divorce had to be finalised.
Wallis was in France, and Edward went to stay in a schloss in Austria. It's kind of unfathomable now to think about it, but when he left England on this, this naval destroyer from Portsmouth, he hadn't really factored where he was going to go or how his life was going to be without the panoply of a royal staff and his entourage. So it's a kind of haunting image of him on the naval destroyer with his dog Slipper. This is the period when the letters between them are the most heartbreaking and revelatory, really. Wallis has had to accept the abdication has happened and everything that means for her. Edward is trying to reassure her that all will be well.
Eventually, in May 1937, Edward and Wallis are finally reunited in France. The British press go wild. They've followed this story. They've waited for this moment of reunion, and really it was seen as a moment where that story, the scandal of the abdication, had finally come to a happy end.
When Edward and Wallis were finally reunited at the Chateau Condé in France, it's really very moving. I mean, he just rushed up the steps to be with her, and they were so tender at that stage because it really was them against the world. I mean, we have to remember that at the time of the abdication, Wallis was getting death threats in the terms of letters on her breakfast tray. And she actually said, every morning when I receive these letters, I know that the world has turned against me, that the world hates me. She had become the most hated woman in the world.
Well, Edward became obsessed after the abdication with Wallis being referred to as Her Royal Highness, and this was a real bugbear of his. He would bring it up constantly in letters to his brother, to his brother George VI. He'd bring it up in letters to the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He'd bring it up at every conceivable opportunity. But the problem was that in British society there was such contempt and disdain for Wallis that nobody wanted to give her any kind of honorific title. Nobody wanted to give her, even calling her the Duchess of Windsor was seen as a bit of a step too far. So the idea that she'd be referred to as Her Royal Highness, people would have to bow to her, that was never going to happen. And Edward was absolutely incensed by this because he saw correctly that it was a snub both to his wife and to him, and that nobody else would have been given this treatment. And you can see that his relationship with George VI, immediately after the abdication crisis, was reasonably civil. But before he got married, the relationship had more or less broken down between the brothers, and the letters they exchanged, open animosity on Edward's part, open anger, and increasingly on George's part, you can see this resignation mixed with a sense of why don't you do what you're told? Edward was spending a lot of time in Austria and in France, where he was coming into the company of people like Charles Bedaux. And Charles Bedaux was this multi-millionaire industrialist who had this chateau which he lent to Edward to get married to. Charles Bedaux was also a Nazi. And the problem was, and this became a running theme of Edward's life, both before his reign, during his reign, and after his reign, is that for somebody who claimed not to be a Nazi, he spent an awful lot of time in the company of people who were. And I think from what we can see about Edward's Nazi sympathies, more so from Wallis's actually, I think Wallis was somebody who was largely apolitical, is that he was somebody who, even if he didn't actually believe in the tenets of Nazism, he wasn't actually a card-carrying supporter of Hitler, he supported an awful lot of what Hitler was doing. He thought Hitler was a strong, vigorous reformer. The fact that he actually met him in 1937 was a catastrophically ill-advised idea.
The Duke of Windsor, as both Prince of Wales and then as King Edward VIII, had taken a real interest in Anglo-German relations. Throughout the 20s, he had sponsored schemes to try and encourage reconciliation between the two countries, given that they'd gone to war against one another in the First World War. One of these ways was bringing together veterans from Germany with veterans from Britain, as a way of trying to heal divisions. He took a particular interest in the Nazi regime, because he saw Hitler as a dynamic, charismatic leader, much like himself. When he'd been Prince of Wales and then King, he'd also been very impressed with what the Nazi Party had done in resolving Germany's unemployment crisis in the mid-1930s. He and Wallace traveled to Nazi Germany in 1937 and met with Adolf Hitler and leading Nazis as part of a short tour which encompassed visits to factories, to industrial sites. And again, Edward was very interested in looking at how it was that Germany had become this up-and-coming country once again under the auspices of the Nazi regime. Edward, like many people of his generation and class, was known to have held anti-Semitic views privately. I think in that respect, there was some crossover with what was going on in Nazi Germany as well. Some historians and biographers have gone so far to suggest that Edward was a fascist sympathizer. Notably, his official biographer never went as far as to suggest that, but it was certainly the case that Edward was very interested in what the Nazis had achieved in Germany and where they were taking the nation.
The reason for that visit was not because they were Nazi sympathisers. It was because Edward felt this tremendous seam of guilt that he had promised Wallace, in a way, the world, and had been able to deliver very little of it. So he couldn't give her the title. I mean, I'm convinced that one of the reasons he bought her so many lavish jewels was to compensate for the fact that she couldn't have the real crown jewels. He wanted to treat her like his queen, and in fact, in all his royal houses, everybody had to address her as HRH. They had to bow and curtsy to her. So when the Germans, cleverly, seeing how weak he was, said, "Will you come on a tour?" And Edward said, "Will you treat this like a royal tour? Will you give my wife the pomp and pageantry she deserves?" And they said yes. So of course he went thinking at last he could show Wallace what it would be like to be a royal queen, a consort on a royal tour. Completely, I think, naively and unaware to the optics, but I do not think that this meant he was a Nazi sympathiser. The other historians I've spoken to don't think that either. I think he was too politically and intellectually stupid to adhere to any ideological or political creed. I genuinely do. And when you read Wallace's diary entries and letters at this time, you know, she's talking about the red geraniums on the window boxes. She was not political, and she wasn't influencing him in any way. It was a massive PR disaster, but in my opinion, that stemmed from naivety and the deeper wound that he carried for the rest of his life, which is all he wanted was recognition for his wife and the status that she deserved.
Edward turned up in Britain again in late 1939, just after the war had started, and royal courtiers, George VI and the British government, are quite anxious that he be given some kind of official role outside of Britain so that he's not overshadowing George VI. He's sent to France, and there his role is to join with British military operatives inspecting France's military preparations for war. So he goes out to the Maginot Line and he's looking at French defences and checking whether the French are prepared for the oncoming German attack. Now, more recently, one of his biographers has actually suggested that Edward was gathering intelligence on the French military preparations, and that because he was quite indiscreet and he'd often meet with representatives from other nations, he let it be known that the French were ill-prepared and that information got back to Nazi Germany and that they planned their attack on France accordingly. There
was definitely a plan to reinstate Edward as king because it was felt by the Nazi high command that if George VI and his family could be either assassinated or done away with or just moved, and a puppet ruler installed on the British throne who was sympathetic to the Nazis and to Hitler, that would be the end of World War II, and that their plans of domination could continue without any kind of difficulty. The problem was, it was all based on a misunderstanding which Hitler had, namely that Edward, or indeed George as king, had power invested in themselves similar to, say, the president in America. And it wouldn't have actually made an enormous amount of difference. What you'd had to have done is you would have had to have removed the entire governing strata of Britain. You would have had to have got rid of Churchill, which Hitler certainly would have done. You had to have got rid of everybody else. And the fact that Edward would have been king might have been interesting symbolically for him.
In spring 1940, there's growing concern about possible Nazi plots involving Edward and Wallis. There's this idea that he might be kidnapped, for example, by the Nazi state, and that they might use him to put pressure on the British government to sue for peace. After May 1940 and the defeat of France, Edward and Wallis flee for, first of all, Spain and then Portugal. Whilst they're there, again, a sort of conspiracy seems to encircle them about whether Edward would in fact like Germany to defeat Britain by bombing it into submission and then put him back in charge of the British monarchy. So there are all these plots, conspiracies, rumours involving Edward possibly returning to Britain as a kind of puppet monarch. It's decided by George VI, his private secretary, and Winston Churchill, now British Prime Minister, that Edward needs to be sent away, that he needs to be out of the public eye, and they decide that he would be best placed as governor of the Bahamas across the Atlantic Sea, where he can do no harm.
Edward felt very slighted to have been given this role of governor of the Bahamas. I mean, you can absolutely understand that you have been King of England, King Emperor, you know, you've ruled over this empire of 500 million people, and you're now going to this tiny island in the Bahamas to be the governor. He felt insulted because after the abdication, he always wanted to have a suitable role, a job within England, and he really did fight for that, but you know, that was not going to be granted by the Queen Mother and Tommy Lascelles. What's really interesting, I think, about his time in the Bahamas is, of course, you know, the press said Wallis was too extravagant at doing up Governor's House and spending all this money, but I spoke to people whose parents knew the Windsors in the Bahamas, and they were incredibly liked. They did a lot for local people, for charities. They really threw themselves into the role. And I think it's really telling that when Edward came back to Britain for his mother's funeral, that the crowds, 5,000 people turned up, and they all called out to him and said, you know, sir, and doffed their caps. A man called Count Rudi von Schönberg, who ran something called the Marbella Club, and he said, you know, in the 60s, 30 years after the abdication, when the Windsors went to stay at the Marbella Club, they would have a discreet table in the corner of the restaurant. And when they got up to leave the table in the evening, every single British person, every man and woman stood and bowed to them. Now that was 30 years after the abdication. So that shows the respect of not really the respect, the love of the people for this man.
Would you like to have gone on and had another job after that, sir?
Yes, I offered my services if they were required. Never got me.
Would you like the Duke to have had a job?
Oh, yes, very much, very much.
In those days, that's 25 years ago.
I think he could have done something.
Why didn't you get a job, do you think?
Have to ask. Most of the people, I think, I'm afraid, are underground now, who prevented me. It's hard to say.
Do you have any regrets when you look back on your life?
Oh, about certain things, yes. I wish it could have been different. But I mean, I'm extremely happy, and naturally, we've had some hard times, but who hasn't? So we'll just have to learn to live with that.